I never thought that my life would turn out this way, but perhaps many people say so, looking back and realizing how far their current daily lives are from childhood dreams or youthful ideas about the future. My name is Rita, and this is my story. I was born and raised on a farm where every morning started with a cock crowing, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the sound of my father's heavy footsteps going out into the yard to check on the cattle. From an early age, I was taught to value work not just as a way to earn a living, but as the foundation of life, as something self-evident and non-negotiable. Getting up at first light, feeding the animals, weeding the beds, carrying heavy buckets of water, all this was part of my world, and I did not think that life could be different. The days went by in the usual rhythm: school, then farming, and on weekends house cleaning and Sunday lunch with my parents, during which we shared the news and discussed plans for the coming week. It was natural for me, and I did not seek to break out of this simple but reliable life. However, my parents saw a different future for me. I remember that night when everything changed. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the sturdy wooden one where I spent my childhood, and we were having dinner when Dad put down his fork and looked at me with his kind but serious eyes. "Rita, my mother and I have been thinking a lot. You should go to college." I raised my head, not immediately realizing the meaning of his words. "College?" I asked, blinking in surprise. "Yes," Mom nodded, putting down her plate. "We want you to have more opportunities than we do." I was shocked. My life has always seemed quite definite to me: school, then maybe marriage, and then working on a farm next to my parents. But now I was being offered something completely different. A few months later, after packing my suitcase and saying goodbye to home, I moved to the city. At first, it seemed alien to me, huge, noisy, and filled with fuss, which did not give me time for thought or silence. Everything was different: the smells, the sounds, even the air, which had no trace of the freshness I was used to. College was also a challenge, not so much the studies, but the people. Young guys from different parts of the country, with ambitions and dreams so far removed from my usual life that I sometimes felt like a stranger among them. And that's when I met Jack. He appeared in my life suddenly, like a summer storm, capturing everything around with his energy and confidence. Tall, with a mischievous smile and eyes full of endless possibilities, he was completely different from the simple guys I grew up with. There was something alluring about him: lightness, freedom, the ability to look at life not as a series of responsibilities, but as an exciting adventure. "Life is too short to waste on exhausting work," he said, leaning back on the grass near the library. "We need to enjoy every moment while we are young." I listened to him with bated breath, and for the first time in my life I wondered if he was right. What if life could really be different? We started dating, and the more time I spent with him, the more my perception of the world changed. When Jack proposed to me, I didn't hesitate for a second. My parents, of course, were careful. They wanted to meet the man who occupied such an important place in my life. "He seems nice," Dad said after meeting Jack, but there was wariness in his voice. "Just be careful, Rita." I just laughed, waving it off. "Oh, Dad, you're just old-fashioned." The wedding was beautiful, and my parents did everything to make our start successful. They paid for the celebration, bought us an apartment in the city, wanting to give me the start that they themselves could only dream of. "We want you to have a good life," Mom said, hugging me goodbye. "I promise I'll make you proud," I replied, hugging them tightly. The first years of our marriage were happy, or at least that's what I thought. We worked, made plans, got used to living together. But looking back, I realized that the cracks appeared even then. "Rita, you're not going to drag me back to your parents' farm, are you?" Jack said, grimacing, when I suggested going on a weekend trip. "It smells like manure, and your father is always trying to make me work." "This is my family, Jack," I sighed, hoping he would understand. "They've done so much for us." "Okay," he replied reluctantly, "but I'm not going to shovel cow shit." I laughed, thinking it was just urban squeamishness, but now, remembering this conversation, I realize Maybe I should have been wary. 2 years after our wedding, I found out that I was pregnant, and this news filled me with such joy that I couldn't think of anything else. I walked the streets with a beaming smile, stroked my flat stomach with my hand and imagined what our child would look like, what his laugh would be, what his first step, his first word would be. My parents were thrilled. My mother was literally screaming with happiness on the phone, repeating over and over again, "Oh, Rita, this is the best thing that could have happened. We are so happy for you. My grandson." I laughed with her, feeling like the happiest woman in the world. Jack reacted differently, not with such an enthusiastic outburst of emotion as I expected. He smiled, hugged me, and said it was wonderful, but there wasn't the genuine joy in his voice that I wanted to hear. "Baby," he muttered, as if tasting the word. I decided that he was just excited, that he needed time to process what was happening, and I suppressed my anxious thoughts, assuring myself that he would definitely warm up to the idea as soon as he saw the baby. My parents, as always, supported us. Their love and care knew no bounds. They bought us a new car, paid for my vacation so I could rest before giving birth, and did everything possible to make our lives comfortable. I was immensely grateful to them for this, but Jack seemed to take all their help for granted. "Of course they help," he said with a lazy smile, "because it's their responsibility. That's what parents do." I sometimes tried to argue, tried to explain to him that their support is a manifestation of love, not a duty, but he just shrugged his shoulders, as if it was an insignificant conversation. When our son Tommy was born, I experienced love again, so pure, so all-consuming that I couldn't even imagine how I had lived without him before. This tiny ball of happiness in my hands has become the meaning of my whole life. I could watch him sleep for hours, feeling his warm, even breath on my skin. I could endlessly listen to his soft sounds, watch his tiny fingers squeeze my finger. Jack. He tried, I'll give him that, but fatherhood didn't come as naturally to him as it did to me. He took his son in his arms, tried to lull him to sleep, but quickly gave up if Tommy started crying. "Can't you silence this kid?" he grumbled, casting displeased glances at the tiny creature that needs us. "Some of us need to work in the morning." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that he was adjusting too, that this was as new an experience for him as it was for me. We went to the farm whenever we could, but each time Jack became more reluctant. "Your father asked me to help with the tractor again," he complained after one trip. "I'm not a mechanic, for God's sake." I watched them that day, my father, who patiently explained, showed step by step, and Jack, who frowned, grimaced, fumbled with tools, as if doing a favor. And then the worst happened. I lost both my parents within 1 year. They were gone. These words sounded like a sentence, like something impossible that I couldn't accept. I sobbed on Jack's shoulder, silently bursting with pain, but he just awkwardly patted me on the back, as if he didn't know what to say. "It's going to be okay," he muttered, "at least they left us the farm." I froze. My whole universe was collapsing. I was losing the people I loved most, and he was thinking about inheriting. But I was too broken, too exhausted by grief and constant care for the baby to argue, to fight. When Jack said at dinner a few months later, "We have to sell the farm," I felt something tighten inside. "What?" I looked up at him in amazement. "Think about it, Rita," he said, chewing bread and not even looking at me. "We could buy a big house in the city, live like kings, and not work ourselves to exhaustion. Isn't that what you want?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to shout that the farm was my family's legacy, that it was my home, that I couldn't just sell it to the first bidder. But I was exhausted. I didn't sleep at night taking care of Tommy. I could barely find the strength to cope with the morning routine, and I just didn't have the energy to fight. "Okay," I said softly, looking down at my plate. "If you think it's better that way." And just like that, with a few signatures on some papers, with the cold formality of a deal, my family story was sold to the one who offered more money. Jack was thrilled when the money came into our account. He was beaming. He was like a child who was given access to everything he ever wanted. "We are ready for life, Rita," he exclaimed, whirling me around the room. "We don't have to work anymore. We can do whatever we want." I nodded, trying to hide the emptiness that was growing inside me, consuming me from the inside out. Life has changed. We really didn't work so hard anymore. The money allowed us to relax, reduce working hours, and enjoy new opportunities. But over time, I began to notice changes in Jack. He's never been a workaholic, but now his laziness has taken on a whole new dimension. He quit his job without warning, making up excuses. "The boss is an idiot. They want too much from me. I'm not a slave, Rita." I tried to talk to him, tried to explain that we can't live on the money from the sale of the farm. "We need to think about the future, Jack," I urged, but he just waved me off. "Relax, Rita," he smiled, sipping his beer. "We are ready for life. Why work to death?" I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time I realized, maybe he never really intended to work. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to live the way he always wanted, without obligations, without work, without responsibility. And now that moment has come. I sat next to Robert's bed, holding his cold, dry hand in my palms, and listened to every word he said, and with each new revelation, a picture unfolded in front of me that was so familiar that at some point I felt really uneasy. He talked about his nephew, Jack, who had dreamed of an easy life since childhood, who never wanted to take responsibility, who ran away as soon as he realized that he would have to work in the family business, and not just receive dividends. He told me, "I don't want to stay up at night like you, worrying about the factory. I want to live, not work myself to death." Robert sighed wearily, and there was so much bitterness in that sigh that my heart sank. I loved that boy, Rita, I really did. I wanted him to have everything, so that he could continue the business I was passionate about, be successful, and not need anything. But he demanded that I sell the business, give him money, buy him an apartment, a car, and provide for him monthly. I felt my throat go dry. These words. It sounded so familiar, so similar to what I'd heard Jack say over the years. "We are ready for life, Rita. Why work yourself to death?" Wasn't that what he told me over and over again, while the money from the farm's sale was melting away, while he refused to work, while he was lounging in an armchair in a bathrobe in broad daylight? When I refused, he left, slamming the door. Robert continued, his voice trembling. "And I haven't seen him since. I tried to contact him, tried to figure out how he was, but he didn't want anything to do with me. And do you know what the scariest thing is? I would have given him the money anyway if he had just stayed. He was just there." I heard Tommy swallow hard next to me. He understood too. I realized that the whole story that Jack had been telling us for years was just a favorable version of the truth. "Do you want to see him?" Tommy asked cautiously. Robert smiled faintly, but shook his head. "No, my boy, he hates me, and I don't think anything has changed." He closed his eyes, as if tired of talking, and his hand tightened a little on mine. "But I'm glad I saw you. I'm glad I met you, Tommy. You seem completely different." When we left the hospital, my thoughts were racing like a broken mirror, the fragments of which randomly reflect light. I felt anger, disappointment, bitterness. Jack lied to me. I've been lying all these years. He talked about a cruel, domineering uncle who wanted to bend him to his will, but in reality was just a man who wanted the best for him. Jack left not because he was forced to do something against his will, but because he was expected to be at least a bit responsible. "Will you tell him?" Tommy asked quietly as we got into the car. I was silent. I didn't know what to say, I didn't know what I wanted. But I realized one thing for sure. I couldn't close my eyes anymore. Jack wasn't the person I thought he was, and I don't think he ever was. I looked at him, at the man who had once been my husband, my life partner, the man I had once loved, and I felt nothing but icy emptiness. His smug grin, his indifference, his cold, calculating eyes. All this had nothing to do with the man I met many years ago. Or maybe I just didn't want to see the truth before. Maybe he was always like this, and I, blinded by love, built illusions, justified his weaknesses, his laziness, his eternal desire to live at someone else's expense. But now there are no illusions left. There was an outsider in front of me, a man who used me like he used my son, like he used his uncle, and now that he had money, he decided he didn't need me anymore. Are you serious? My voice sounded even, too even, as if I was looking at the situation from the outside. Jack lazily leaned back on the couch, reached for a glass of whiskey and took a leisurely sip. Well, Rita, let's not make a drama, he grinned, tilting his head to the side, as if I were a moody child who couldn't accept the obvious. You know how it works. A man, when he has money, wants something newer. And you think I'm just going to agree? You can do anything, dear, he shrugged, waving his hand casually. Of course, if you try to squeeze money out of me, you won't succeed. And if you keep quiet, I can be generous. I looked at him, listened to him, tried to realize that this was really happening, that it wasn't a bad dream, not some stupid mistake. Do you know what's funny? I said, and my lips trembled, but not from fear, not from pain, from rage, from the fact that I had allowed myself to be blind for so long. I don't need your money. All I need is for you to disappear from my life. He raised his eyebrows in surprise, as if he hadn't expected such audacity from me, but then he laughed. Oh, finally. I thought that you would cling to me to the last. No, Jack, I shook my head, looking at him with icy disdain. You were the one who clung to me. All these years you've been using me, living off me, off my family, and now you've found another source of income and decided you can just erase me from your life. Well, for God's sake. I turned around and went into the bedroom, packing my things as fast as if my life depended on it. Tommy. I have to call Tommy. I have to leave. But before I could take a step, Jack grabbed my arm. Where are you going? His voice was still mocking, but there was something dark and dangerous in his eyes. I'm leaving, Jack, I pulled my hand away, feeling my body tremble. And you won't stop me. Where are you going? He chuckled. The farm is sold, the money is spent. You have nowhere to go, Rita. I looked at him and saw through him for the first time in years. I saw how scared he was. He's afraid of not losing me, but he's afraid of losing his comfortable world, where he could use people as he pleased. You're wrong, I smiled, looking him straight in the eye. I have Tommy. And you don't have anyone. I was sitting in an empty house that had once been filled with voices and laughter, where life went on as usual, but now it seemed like an empty shell, abandoned, burned to the ground, where memories of the past echoed in every corner, which turned out to be a lie. I looked at the walls, at the furniture, at the framed photographs that still showed smiles, mine, Tommy's, even Jack's, but now it all seemed like an illusion, a play of shadows, something that had never really existed. I didn't know how much time had passed as I sat hugging myself, as if trying to keep what was left of me from disintegrating. There was only one thought throbbing in my head: what now? Jack left, leaving only ruins behind, taking the money, the inheritance, even the hope that once there was something real between us. But was this hope true? Or was I deluding myself by turning a blind eye to the obvious? All his words, actions, even his looks, now that I remembered them, everything came together, and I couldn't believe I'd been blind for so long. Taking a deep breath, I wiped away my tears. Tommy was right, I'm strong, I can handle it. I won't let Jack break me, I won't let his betrayal become the final point in my life. Mom, you need to rest. Tommy's voice was soft but insistent. He stood next to her, his eyes full of concern, but there was no pity in them, only determination and love. I smiled at him, though it was a weak, almost invisible smile. Yes, son, you're right. We both need to think about what to do next. Tommy sat down next to me, his hand covering mine. "We're going to be fine," he said firmly. "We'll start all over again." And at that moment, I realized that I could really do it. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of clarity that I hadn't had in a long time. For the first time in years, I didn't have to think about Jack, his whims, or how to please a man who had never appreciated me. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table and took out my notebook. Tommy was right, we had the opportunity to start over, but we needed a plan. First of all, finances. Jack left, leaving me with nothing but debts and empty bills, but I had a house that I could sell, and I also had a profession, the ability to work, and the will to live. Secondly, I wasn't going to let Jack just walk away like nothing had happened. He could consider himself a winner, but I wasn't a woman who could just be thrown away as an unnecessary thing. I opened my laptop and started searching for information. Uncle Robert's will did not exist, but there were laws, there were legal subtleties that Jack might not have considered. The more I read, the more I realized that Jack wasn't as invulnerable as he thought. He expected me to just accept everything as it was, that I would be broken, submissive, that I would disappear from his life as quietly as he wanted me to. But he was wrong. "Tommy," I called to my son when he entered the kitchen. "We need to see a lawyer." He looked at me in surprise, but there was a glint in his eyes. "Did you come up with something?" I smiled, this time sincerely. "Oh, yes, son. I'm not going to give this man everything he stole." Tommy grinned and nodded. "That's what I understand, Mom." And I realized that for the first time in a long time, I feel truly alive. But even the realization that justice had been served did not bring me complete relief. Yes, I was no longer connected to this man. Yes, his new, sweet life collapsed as quickly as it began, but there was still an unknown ahead that had to be overcome. The divorce was coming to an end, and I got our house, the only thing left from my previous life. But now this house, which had once seemed like a fortress to me, was filled with ghosts of memories, too loud, too vivid to just ignore them. I knew that staying in this place would mean living among the shadows of the past, and so the decision came naturally. I had to move on, radically change my life, leave behind not only Jack, but also the self that had allowed him to control his fate for so many years. "Mom, are you sure?" Tommy looked at me doubtfully when I told him about my decision. "This is our house, you put so much soul into it." I smiled at him, squeezing his hand, and shook my head. "It's just the walls, son. A house is not a building, but what you feel when you enter it. And when I come in here, I only feel pain." He nodded, and I knew he understood. We have already experienced too much to cling to the ruins of the past. The sale of the house went faster than I expected, and a month later, Tommy and I were standing on the porch of a new apartment, small, cozy, in the city center, with windows overlooking the park. There was no past, no shadows, just a blank slate, ready for new stories. I got a job at a law firm, where, as it turned out, my knowledge and life experience turned out to be much more in demand than I might have thought. Every morning, passing by the mirror, I looked at my reflection and finally saw there a woman who was no longer afraid, did not suffer, did not seek approval. I was myself, free, strong, ready for life. And Jack? The last I heard about him, he left town, leaving behind only debts and disappointments. I felt neither pity nor gloating. He made his choice, just like I did. "Mom, I'm proud of you," Tommy said one night when we were having dinner together. I looked at him and smiled. "I'm proud of you too, son." And at that moment, I realized that for the first time in many years, I was really happy. The rain drummed on the glass, dropping heavy drops on the windowsill, and wearily rubbing my temples, I reflected on how bizarrely life places its pieces on the chessboard of fate. I thought I'd left Jack in the past, buried him under a pile of memories and erased his existence along with our history, but as it turns out, the past can find loopholes, creeping up on you even when you finally close the door behind him. And here he was again, the man who had once been everything to me, and then turned into someone I no longer even wanted to know. Jack stood on the threshold of my new life, soaked, disheveled, and a stranger. His once confident bearing was gone, his shoulders were slumped, and there was such sincerity in his eyes that I might even have felt pity if I hadn't remembered what he had done to me. "Rita," his voice was broken, as if he had to squeeze out the words through pain. I was such a fool. It took me losing everything to figure out what was really important. I didn't answer, just stared at him with my arms crossed over my chest, feeling a strange, mixed feeling rise up inside me, not anger, not satisfaction, not joy, but something like fatigue, as if I was watching a play whose ending I already knew. "Will you let me in? I just want to talk." I knew it was a bad idea, and I knew it wouldn't do any good, but against my better judgment, I stepped back and let him enter. Perhaps, somewhere deep in my heart, I wanted to see what state he had reached. I wanted to make sure that life really put everything in its place. He sat down on my old sofa, casually stretching his legs forward, and over the next hour poured out his soul to me, telling me how he ended up with nothing, how his young wife left, how the debt pit dragged him so deep that it became almost impossible to get out. He talked about regret, how stupid he had been to reject a woman who truly cared about him, and how he had only just realized that he had loved me all these years. "Rita," his voice trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Please give me one more chance. Marry me again." I froze for a second, taking it all in, and then I laughed. It was a real, deep laugh, one that comes straight from the soul, liberating and almost painful, because I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in a long time. Jack's face fell, his brows furrowed, and resentment flashed in his eyes. "What's so funny?" he muttered, clutching the box in his palm. I caught my breath with difficulty, wiping the tears from my eyes, and shook my head. "Oh, Jack. Did you really think it would be that easy? Do you leave me, tear our lives to pieces, and then come back when you feel bad, hoping that I'll take you back?" His face darkened, his features distorted with displeasure. "Listen to me." He abruptly jumped to his feet, and the familiar commanding notes sounded in his voice again. "This is my house too. I have rights." I calmly stepped to the bedside table, opened the drawer and took out the divorce papers, handing them to him. "No, Jack," my voice was quiet but firm. "You signed it yourself. You've given up any rights to this house. He is mine." He looked at the papers, then at me, and I could see thoughts flickering in his eyes, as he tried to find a way out, but realized that there was none left. For a moment, it seemed to me that he would continue to fight, that he would start shouting or threatening, but instead he just clenched his teeth, turned around and left, slamming the door loudly. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel any malice. There was only a sense of the final, irrevocable point set in that chapter of my life that had remained unclosed for too long. When he left, I immediately called Tommy, told him everything, and, as always, he proved to be my main support. "You did the right thing, Mom," he said, and there was pride in his voice. "You're finally free of him." Those words meant more to me than he could have imagined. In the following weeks, I made another important decision. My house, with all its ghosts of the past, was too big for me alone. I no longer wanted to live among walls soaked with memories of who I was, of the pain I went through. So I sold it, buying a cozy apartment in an area I've always loved, but which Jack considered too noisy and unsuitable. And then I started living. To really live. I went on a trip, saw places that I always dreamed of visiting, but for which I always didn't have enough time or didn't have a reason. I took up painting, joined a book club, tried salsa, and, as it turned out, I was pretty good at it. I started meeting new people, opening up to the world, trying, making mistakes, but at the same time feeling alive, free, and happy. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of Jack in the city. He looked older, tired, and devastated, like a man who realized his mistakes but couldn't fix them. He didn't come up to me, didn't try to say anything else, just looked at me from afar, and then disappeared into the crowd. Life didn't turn out the way I expected, but I wouldn't want things to be any different. Because now, for the first time in many years, I was truly happy.